Hello and welcome to the Vulgar Eclectic. I'm recording this on Friday, and since it is just a couple of days until Easter, I thought I would try doing the Easter book tag. This was created by Rosie the Reader, so I'll put a link to that down below and check that out if you haven't already. The first question, or the first prompt I should say, is the word rabbits. A book that you wish would multiply. In other words, a book you'd like to see a sequel written to. The first book that comes to mind is The Debacle by Emile Zola. It's part of a 20-book cycle. I cannot for the life of me pronounce things in French, so you should look the pronunciation up yourself if you are so inclined. But it's Les Rogan Macaw. Something like that. I read a number of books out of this cycle, although definitely not all of them. They are fantastic, or the ones I have read are just wonderful. They've just drawn me so into the world that Zola creates. And most of all, perhaps, is The Debacle. The Debacle is actually the 19th of 20 books in this cycle. And the character of Jean, who is prominent in The Debacle, is also a primary character in an earlier book in the series called The Earth. And so in a way, I suppose, technically speaking, possibly, it does have a sequel of sorts. It has a book that follows it in the series, but it's not a direct sequel. It doesn't involve the same characters or anything like that. So in my mind, it's not a sequel. And that book, I had such a wonderful reading experience with. I had actually had a surgery on my leg that I had to stay in bed for a period of time, just completely in bed. And I started reading that book, and wow, I just had such a fantastic, immersive experience. I can recall another time in my childhood, actually. I was an adult when I read this, but in my childhood, I remember watching Dances with Wolves, that movie, and I remember thinking toward the end of it, I don't want this movie to end. I want it to just keep going. And I don't get that feeling a lot as an adult in books or movies. I did as a child occasionally. But I did have that feeling with The Debacle. It was so wonderful. And the Jean and Maurice, the two main characters, are so well drawn and just so likable and so aptly written that I felt for them deeply. I felt so, again, like I mentioned, so immersed in the unfolding of events. It was so vivid and raw feeling. So I don't know if that could really be replicated in a sequel. I know that's the notorious Achilles' heel in storytelling, isn't it? Coming up with a sequel that somehow captures the magic of the original. So maybe I wouldn't really actually want to see a sequel to it. I love it on its own. All right, prompt number 2 is Egg, a book that surprised you. I'm going back quite a ways for this one. This was way back in my senior year in high school. And the final book we were reading for the class was going to be Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. At the time, I knew very little about the history of literature, and before I began reading Wuthering Heights, I perceived it to be a romance novel, and as a 17-year-old boy, that was a genre that I just wasn't interested in. It wasn't the fantasy that I was reading a lot of at the time, and I thought there was no way I would enjoy the book or appreciate the reading experience. I was not looking forward to it, but I started reading it, and I was profoundly surprised. I enjoyed the experience immensely. In fact, I suppose looking back on it, that experience probably opened my mind a bit to reading a wider variety of books. And that was thanks in large part to the teacher I had. She was an absolutely brilliant English teacher, high school English teacher. I liked her so much. She was so thoughtful. She presented the material in a way that I found so engaging. I can't speak for other students, of course, in the class, but it really worked for me. And I really enjoyed that whole year. We had to do a senior research paper in it of the topic of our choice, and I chose Robin Hood as depicted in various fictions and how that related to him as a potential real historical figure. I was heavily indebted to a book that I kind of obsessively read at the public library by J.C. Holt. It was a scholarly look into Robin Hood as a historical figure and into the evolution of the literature surrounding that character. I was hugely in love with Robin Hood and the romance of those stories. And I, as a child, memorized where on the bookshelves in the public library that book was, and I'd make a beeline to that area when we'd go to the library, and I'd get it out and read through some of it, and I'd check it out for a while, and then it'd be time to return it, and then I'd read it another time. I'd be at the library when it would be on the shelf, and just in that manner, read through much of it repeatedly. I can still remember one of the passages in some of the old ballads. I think this one was from the Percy Folio, and it was this particular ballad that dealt with Robin Hood's death, and it has a unfortunate break in the text because of damage to the manuscript. And I haven't looked at this recently, but I believe it was something like Robin Hood and Little John were traveling. I think they were going to Kirklees Abbey to get his blood drawn as a treatment. I believe in that story I think he was depressed because Maid Marian had been killed, but I might be wrong on that detail. But he was traveling with Little John to Kirklees Abbey, and he got to a stream with. There was a woman, and by the stream, and in the ballad, it says the old woman was banning Robin Hood. And I remember learning at the time that meant cursing Robin Hood, and so it was very dark and foreboding, and seemed to foreshadow disaster down the road for Robin Hood. And I just found that whole passage, and the fact that it broke off there so you couldn't find out maybe why she was banning Robin Hood, or what additionally she might have to say, or any more details about the encounter, made it even more foreboding. Anyway, that was a little side detour, but I ended up doing the senior research paper in that class on basically those ideas, or that topic, I should say, and I really enjoyed it. And I got to incorporate my huge Robin Hood collection. I had a massive collection of Robin Hood books. Every time I'd go to used bookstores and antique stores and things like that, I'd look for old Robin Hood books, and it had amassed a number of them by that time. Most, of course, were quite similar to each other, basic retellings. Although there was one older one that was really odd. It had very unique stories and characters that I didn't find in any of the other stories. And I couldn't find a printing date on it. It was a very strange book, but very cool to have found. Anyway, sorry, back to the book that surprised me, Wuthering Heights. I ended up thoroughly enjoying that reading experience, very much so. And it surprised the heck out of me. I thought there was no way I was going to enjoy this, what I saw as a mushy romance. But that's what a good book will do to you, I guess. All right, and on to question or prompt number 3, Hunt. A book that was hard for you to get your hands on. This reminds me of something from my childhood again. I mentioned in my BookTube newbie tag how my dad read me 2 books from his childhood about a character named Tom Stetson who went on trips in the Amazon with his uncle in the summertime between school years. There were 2 that we had that were my dad's old copies, but there was actually a 3rd book that my dad never had as a child called Tom Stetson and the Blue Devils. And my dad tried to track that down. And this was in the era before the internet. So when we would go to used bookstores or junk stores, antique stores, things like that, he would look for it and sometimes ask the proprietor if they had access to it or anything like that. And he eventually did track it down. He got it through the mail eventually from somebody that he had met in another state, a book dealer, was able to track it down, and my dad bought it. And eventually, as an adult, finally got the 3rd book in that series. So that wasn't my hunt, but that was my dad looking for a book. And that's what that prompt makes me think of. The only other thing I guess I would add that's more my own is that I collected the original Star Wars comics. I'll go into that in more detail some other time. But it took me a long time to get them all. I'd pick them up here and there all over the place. When I'd be traveling or my family would go somewhere, I'd try and find more of them at the comic shops and bookstores and things like that. And eventually I got all 107 of the original run, plus the 4 issues of Return of the Jedi and the annuals. And that was kind of like that. It wasn't necessarily a particular one that was hard. It was just the process of finally getting all of them. It was really fun. All right, the next prompt is Lambs, a children's book that you still enjoy. Oh, well, there's a number of those. There's quite a number of those. I've had the opportunity to read numerous children's books as an adult, and there are quite a few actually that I've realized are still very good. One that comes to mind, there's a bit of a caveat, and that's that it's maybe not exactly a kid's book. It is. I mean, kids love it. But it's written in such a way that it's wonderful for all ages, and that's Calvin and Hobbes. So not explicitly a children's book, but again, a book that children, if you give them, if they like to read and you give them a Calvin and Hobbes book, I'd be surprised if they didn't like it. Although everybody's taste is so different, so who knows. But I love that as an adult. I love those collections as an adult. Another book in the vein of Calvin and Hobbes are all the various collections of Peanuts comic strips. I started reading them at a very young age. We subscribed to a newspaper, or my family subscribed to a newspaper while I was growing up. And of course, us kids, loved reading the comics section. I read them, I guess you would say, almost religiously. I never wanted to miss reading one. I even read ones I didn't really like all that much. There were only a handful of them that I wasn't really into, but I think because they were probably aimed at a different audience. I imagine that's where I first encountered the Peanuts characters and comic strip. Something in it resonated with me, though, at a very young age. I think I know what it is now. I was having, well, I guess even at a young age, I had feelings of depression and things like that. And I think Charles Schulz taps into that a lot in his work and his writing and in his comics. That was one of the things I think that appealed to me in it. But I remember I used to go to the public library with my family, and we'd go once every so often and get books, and I would find these great big hardcover collections, oversized hardcover collections of the Peanuts, and I'd check these big volumes of compilations of lots of different strips, and I'd check those out and bring them home, and I loved reading through those. And I remember one summer I was reading those a lot, and I would lie out underneath this tree where I had a little tree. It wasn't really a tree fort, it was a platform that my dad had built up there. And I would lie under that tree, and this sounds really goofy, but I had a pair of shorts that I felt were very much like the shorts that Charlie Brown wore. And that was a neat thing. And still as an adult, I really enjoy reading the Peanuts. And I think just one other that I would mention, there are so many, and this is another one of those prompts I could go on and on about, I think. But one I did want to mention in a little more detail is Winnie the Pooh. There are numerous different compilations, I believe, and editions. The first 2 collections of stories by A.A. Milne. The first one is just Winnie the Pooh, I believe, and the second one is The House at Pooh Corner. Both of those have illustrations by Ernest Shepard, and those books are beautiful. Beautiful stories, beautiful characters, beautiful illustration, and they are a joy to read as an adult as well. The story of the Heffalumps, for example, comes to mind. The next prompt is Spring, a book with a cover that makes you think of spring. I actually stepped away from recording this for this prompt. This one I had a really hard time coming up with anything at first. So I set it aside for a little bit later. And while I was thinking about it, I suddenly remembered this wonderful little book. It's called A Friend is Someone Who Likes You by Joan Walsh England. And I'd seen these similar faces drawn before. I don't really know where, but the illustration was very familiar to me. But it's such a quaint, cute, little, odd book. And it's a good feeling book. And it makes me think of spring. And maybe it's the green of the little hardback. Maybe it's a little bit of the sense of new beginnings and spring and freshness. And those feelings are in the book. And it's just a really cute little book about friendship and about wild things. It's a great little book. Okay, then there's Jesus, a religious or spiritual book that you love. Well, let's see. I've read the Dhammapada, and I went through a period of time where I really enjoyed reading that. I think regardless of one's faith or spiritual outlook, it can be a very beautiful and useful book. Same goes for the Gospels. There is a book that when I was in junior high, I was in a geography class, and at the end of the year, we had a barter day. I guess so us kids would learn about trade and how communities in some parts of the world did and still do, and actually, you can encounter it anywhere really, can barter for goods. So everybody would bring one object, and we'd had a bit of a bazaar set up in the classroom, and everybody had a blanket they sat on the floor, I believe, or maybe it was at the desk. I think it was on the floor though. And you had your object, and you kind of haggled with people and tried to trade and tried to come up with mutually acceptable trades. And I ended up trading whatever I had for the object that the teacher brought. He brought a book, and so I guess I just loved books. And this particular book had that painting of a dragon on the cover, so that made me like it even more. I had no idea when I got it, but it turned out to be a Christian book, a religious book. I didn't know it then, but I brought it home, and I read. It was a book of kind of like of parables almost, and it was called St. George and the Dragon, not Saint George. It looked like it was St. period, but when you read the book, you find out it's St. George and the Dragon. I don't remember the author's name. I will have to look that up for this video. And as an adult, I went back and read it from cover to cover. I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was really neat. And I remember as a young person reading it and trying to get my mind around some of the ideas that were in it. There were some pretty interesting takes on religion and morality, and the Lord of Wreck, I remember, and this person turning into a cockroach, and oh my goodness, and going underneath the refrigerator in this guy's house, and him meeting George deciding he was going to go on a quest. He was basically having a midlife crisis, and he gets his grandfather's old sword and decides to go out on a quest, and is stopped almost right away by a dragon who says, no, go back home and build a hermitage. And in George's case, it was in his garage. He turned it into his hermitage, where he, I guess, basically began to construct an interior life of introspection, not in a selfish way or something that led to isolation, but in a way that allowed him to become more in touch with himself and his faith, and by extension be able to commune with those around him in a more meaningful way. It was an interesting book. I found it thought-provoking, and I enjoyed reading it. Okay. Rising from the Dead is the next prompt. A book from a deceased author. Oh my goodness. Most of the books I read are from deceased authors. So that could be any number. I guess I'll think of the book that is probably from the oldest of deceased authors that I've read. And that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that's actually appropriate because one of the themes in the Epic of Gilgamesh is what is it in Latin? Timor mortis conturbat me. The fear of death disturbs me. That book is about that. It's a big part of the story is Gilgamesh's fear of death. And is it fear of death, though, his own death, or the death of those that he loves? Or perhaps both, I suppose. But anyway, humanity's, or human individuals wrestling with that heaviest of life's realities. And that's a great book, The Epic of Gilgamesh. It's so interesting that it's one of the earliest examples of literature, and it still speaks to the very questions we grapple with today. It's absolutely amazing to me. All right, the next prompt is baskets, a book that is in your Amazon cart or wish list right now. Well, let's see. I guess when it's on my wish list is I wanted to get a copy of the complete. Oh, there's I think it's from Modern Library. I think it's called Poetry, or it's called Prose, Poetry, and Plays of Alexander Pushkin. I think the title is pretty close to that anyway. I've read a digital version of it. Not all of it, but much of it. Much of the poems. I haven't read a lot of the other stuff. I guess I read Boris Godunov, or however you might say that, a play that he wrote. It's in that, but at any rate, I'd like to get the actual physical book. That's one I've looked at purchasing for a while, but haven't yet. I really like what I've read by him, and it would be great fun to have a whole bunch of his work in one beautiful book that I could crack open and read from whenever I felt like it. All right, the next prompt is Candy, a book that is sweet. If you can't tell, I'm doing this off the top of my head, so pardon all the... Well, I'll cut out some of these long pauses perhaps where I'm just going, because that's basically what these are making me do. A book that is sweet. Is sweet. Well, there's this book called Mama, Do You Love Me? It's a children's book with really, really neat artwork, and it takes place in the Arctic North. It's something like, Mama, do you love me? And then the mom says, yes, I will always love you. It's a cute little baby talking, and the cute baby says something like, well, what if I turn into a polar bear and try to eat you? Will you love me? And she says, yes, I would be scared, but I will still love you. And all these different scenarios that the child puts out there, and I guess wants to be reassured that the parent will love them no matter what. And the parent unequivocally states their love for the child, and how nothing in the world will ever change that. It's a very sweet book. I love it. And then Peeps, Tag People. Well, I don't know anybody on YouTube or on BookTube really yet, so plus I think this has been around for quite some time, but I'll try and find a few newish channels and tag them down in the below in the video, whatever you call that area down there where you can write the description. There we go. I'll tag some people's channels in the description. I'll try to find 3. I'll give myself a challenge. All right, well, that is the Easter book tag created by Rosie the Reader. Thank you very much for listening, and leave any comments you might have, and I will talk to you again. Thanks, and happy reading.